Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Negative Modifier Book Club, aka Negative Modifier Reads. We'll be talking about the book Winter Tide by Ruthanna Emrys. Emrys? I pronounced that right?
Ruthanna Emrys is how I've been going with.
Makes sense, yeah. We'll be talking about Winter Tide by Ruthanna Emrys. As always, I'm Charlie, and as always, I'm joined by Jad for this thing. And yeah, we got the note from the last one. The summary section's going to be a little bit shorter. Sorry, to back up a step. For those not familiar how we do this, basically we're going to summarize the book some. This will not be a full, in-depth summary. We're actually going to mean that this time. Then we'll kind of talk through our thoughts on the book and kind of like our takeaways from it. A general critique, if you will, kind of a more critical eye on the book. And then we'll finish this off with kind of what would you do within tabletop RPGs to utilize this book in some way? Like what ideas we liked about it, kind of what concepts, what we think is worth harvesting or kind of emulating or kind of copying in some way, shape, or form. The ideas that resonate well with us, whether it be kind of a character, a thing, concept, an action sequence of some kind. Yeah, all on the table type of thing. And yeah, we'll probably do some system recommendations for that. You're inspired by this. But yeah, I guess some basic background information on that. You want to cover this, Jed?
So I was recommended Winter Tide through a couple different sources. It was one of those things where I really was engaged with another book that we're hopefully going to be covering, The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval, which is a really phenomenal retelling of a Lovecraft short story that really kind of elevates it, in my opinion. It's not something that it's a really good remix. Let me just kind of go with that. But basically, I was finding things that kind of address Lovecraft in his writing in the way that not critiques, but confronts the author in a way that challenges or kind of brings up counterpoints in who and what he views as monsters or monstrous people, or yeah, just how he kind of presents monsters, I guess.
Yeah, I guess to kind of like put a more cogent kind of point on this. For those not familiar, H.P. Lovecraft, despite both of us being fans of his work, was, put it bluntly, a bit of a monster, a bigot, probably an agoraphobe in a variety of ways, and was just kind of afraid of anything that wasn't same and himish at the end of the day, which is evident in lots of his work. And there's been a lot of really great work that he's either taken kind of the very cool concepts he came up with and taken them further in more interesting kind of inventive ways, put them through more kind of culturally sensitive lenses, or in some cases just flat out confronted the baked in racism of much of his work.
Mm.
And both me and Jad are big fans of when people kind of successfully take H.P. Lovecraft's work and elevate it and kind of make it more than the sum of its parts in some ways. It's why we're fans of Delta Green. It's why we're a fan of the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG. Like, it is a genre that at least I appreciate in a variety of mediums.
I mean, this kind of engagement with this specific American literature, there's like high academia classes and high academics who are constantly in conversation about deconstructing the world that him and other authors have contributed to. A lot of the Cthulhu mythos is not exactly all 100% H.P. Lovecraft.
Robert Chambers actually predates Lovecraft technically, and that's the King in Yellow guy. And there's an argument to be made that actually the Lovecraft mythos should actually be the Chambers mythos because they're so interwoven, and he did technically come first, but he did not get quite as popular.
But yeah, Wintertide kind of ties together the Shadow over Innsmouth, as well as kind of plays with a couple characters from The Thing on the Doorstep.
Yeah, it plays with a smattering of, I guess, kind of mythos things. I guess kind of the more kind of the summary part of it. This is technically the second work by Ruthanna Emrys. This is her first novel. The first thing's a novella, technically?
It was a novella. I think it showed up as a short story in a compilation. It's called The Litany of Earth. It introduces you to a couple key characters that you're going to be finding in Wintertide. You'll meet Afra Marsh or get introduced to Afra Marsh through Litany of Earth, as well as Charlie Day, Neko Koto, as well as Ron Spector.
Yeah, I will say it's not mandatory reading for this. I think this book works better without that in some ways than going back, kind of add some nice context, but we'll get into that later. This is book 1 of 2 of a series called The Innsmouth Legacy. I do not believe we'll be doing the second book for reasons we'll touch upon later, but yeah, this came out in 2017, so it's a little bit more recent than our previous book. Let's just get into it, I suppose. I guess where's the right place to start with this? Like, we can start at the very beginning where we get introduced to Afra and Charlie to a certain extent. The book consists of multiple stories that may or may not come to satisfying conclusions or get kind of actually realized throughout. We start the story off with Afra Marsh getting approached by Agent Spector to basically go do some spying because they are worried that. Sorry, we should back up a step. What year does this take place? It's like 1950s?
1946, if I recall correctly. It's literally chapter 1. It just says it's in the 1940s. September 1948.
I have 1949. Story starts off with Afra Marsh and her employer / student Charlie being approached by Agent Spector in 1948, 1949, the starting of the Cold War in many ways. The backbone of the story basically revolves around kind of using hypergeometry or magic for espionage or Cold War purposes, although this plot gets lost about 2/3 of the way into the book. We'll get to that in a few minutes. And they are tasked with trying to track down a Russian agent for Spector who may or may not be kind of infiltrating Miskatonic University or its surrounding universities, specifically to learn about the art of body swap. Those out the context, Miskatonic University is the place where lots of the books confiscated during the Innsmouth raid get sent to. It's also kind of within the greater Lovecraft mythos, a place where lots of eldritch research happens and people are constantly getting pulled inside out and pulled into weird dimensions, and yet they somehow manage to maintain a credible college worth going into. I believe it's modeled after kind of like was created to kind of be like another Ivy League. It's very much kind of like a Harvard or a Yale or kind of a Princeton or something. It's supposed to be of that style and kind of prestige. Exists in the made-up town of Arkham. Yes, the same Arkham that goes on to lend its name to stuff like the Arkham Asylum from Batman. It's even outside of the mythos, kind of Miskatonic and the town of Arkham have gained a fair amount of fame kind of as a reference for horror. But yeah, so they get recruited to that. They basically give Afra gets given you're going to do this or else type of deal, as our listeners are ever so familiar with when it comes to Delta Green. This is not a Delta Green story. This is just a FBI using a person that they have in a compromising situation to do their dirty work. And then we were introduced to the rest of the cast, not quite in that order, but that's where we meet Neko, Afra's adopted sister. Is that rather right word for kind of adopted sister, foster sister? What would you call that relationship more?
So contextually, Neko and Afra met in internment. Initially, the deep ones who Afra is, or as she calls herself, Child of the Water, meets Neko. It doesn't say like exactly where. It's not like it's like, oh, they met in Manzanar or anything else like that. But they meet in an internment camp, and then after they were released, Afra, whose entire people died during internment, except her and her brother, Afra starts living with the Kotos in San Francisco. Her brother is currently out in the wild as he is attempting to find out what the hell happened to Innsmouth and all of its residents.
And for the most part, she has I'd qualify as a positive relationship with Kotos for the most part. If you're listening to this on the audiobook like me and Jad did, this is your first unfortunate accent of the voice recordings, but it's not as bad as the previous ones we've had, I suppose, but also not great. But yeah, her brother Caleb's kind of the next that gets introduced. He's been skulking about the town of Arkham trying to recover the books, where Afra definitely seems to be playing the long game on some of these things, trying to regain some of the Deep One knowledge or the Children of the Water knowledge and books via more legitimate means. Caleb has a more, let's call it, aggressive and less sympathetic to humans approach to it. Arguably, deservedly not so sympathetic.
Well, in essence, it's kind of Caleb trying to get retributions or reparations to what happened to him and Afra and stuff. Just because, like, the citizens, the denizens, the people of Innsmouth were just whisked away and then put in an internment. They were undergoing the process of metamorphosis in these camps. They're being dissected, they're being tested upon, they're being tortured and held away from water.
Yeah, we'll talk about kind of the problems tying this so directly to Shadow over Innsmouth creates and all that stuff as in kind of our second section of this. But as presented, and I'd argue even like without the kind of stuff we're going to talk about later, the Deep One population at the internment camp is subjected to inhuman torture. Part of, at least presented in the book, the part of the kind of metamorphosis process that hybrids go through where they go from essentially human to true Deep Ones requires salt water. And either it's just kind of absent-mindedness or a deliberate choice. They are denied this. Like there's a couple, like I think some of the better writing in the book revolves actually around just how horrible the camps were and just kind of like, they're not asking for much. They're asking for literally like a cup of salt water or something to ease their suffering type of thing. And I think it does a very good job of kind of just really driving home just how rightfully angry both Afra and Caleb should be at not just the U.S. government, but literally every human, probably.
And that's kind of where the relationship between the Kodos is special.
Yeah.
As further in the book, there's like flashbacks that are kind of in italics that you can kind of differentiate from the main story that's kind of happening. But when Afra meets the Kodos kind of are initially shocked by the appearance and just kind of who they are or what's going on. But instead of kind of judging them by their looks or kind of what's happening around them, they ask, what do you need? How can we help? When they see Caleb and Afra struggling to take care of their uncle, if I recall correctly,
Sounds right, yeah.
Yeah, who is going through who's
dying. He's dying. Yeah.
But so like the Kotos are Afra's really kind of only major relationship other than Caleb. And then Charlie, who is kind of in a working relationship because he owns a bookstore. She works in the bookstore. She's teaching him magic and he kind of gives her access to the collections as well as connections through it.
I was going to say an important thing to bring up is the fact that Charlie runs a bookstore that specializes in Eldritch text. Maybe not officially, but there's a collection. Our kind of introductory scene involving both of them revolves around them coming across basically, I think it's like a yard sale essentially.
It was like an estate sale?
Yeah, estate sale that like they find someone has a bunch of books worth buying and the sellers do not know at all what they have type of situation.
They find the De Anima Pluvia, Soul of the Rain, and it kind of is an establishing tome because it teaches some of the basic magic that kind of continues on with it. It's called the Inner Sea, which is really phenomenal as a mechanic to create the relationships that happens throughout the book. This book is very character driven. It's very character relationship driven. As Charlie had previously stated, there is an espionage Cold War era plot, but it does take a little bit of a backseat.
Every plot takes a backseat to every other plot in a weird way, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Yeah, like both on that critique and the kind of Inner Sea stuff, that becomes more of an important part later, and we'll talk about it there. But yeah, so basically the setup is Spectre, I don't want to quite say blackmails Afra into going to work for him, but I'm not going to say doesn't not blackmail him either. Not blackmail her either. Charlie volunteers / wants to go because, hey, his magic teacher is going, might as well go type of thing. And hey, it's Miskatonic University. There are worse places to find yourself if you're into this type of stuff. And that's where Kayla gets added back in. No, and Neko also volunteers to go along because she wants to see the world. It's a place she's not been and wishes to see it type of situation. So that's your basic setup. That's where Caleb gets added back into this. Caleb is where Afra is patient and kind of seems to understand not all humans are the ones that were at the camp. Caleb is, I think, the kind of flip side of that, where he is rightfully angry still. And like Jed said, wants reparations, wants their books back. There is a kind of important thing we'll talk about now, which is that both characters are young enough at the time of the Innsmouth raids where the more complicated topic of the Innsmouth raid gets to be kind of glossed over. And you get to have these two characters that are kind of a little bit, I don't want to say unaware of the weirder conversations that have to happen when you talk about Deep Ones, but, and Innsmouth for that matter. But yes, you basically kind of have two sides of the same coin. You have the character that understands not all humans are terrible, and the other one that's kind of, I don't want to say closer to kind of your stereotypical writing of Deep Ones, but also isn't too far off, where he's rightfully angry. Like, it's, we are better than humans because they kind of technically are, blah, 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 blah. I guess also part of the blackmailing part of the process is Spectre heavily implying, yeah, your brother keeps getting in trouble. Be a shame if we decide to crack the whip on that one.
But Ron Spectre kind of offers the ability to access these tomes and these histories of Innsmouth through the blackmailing of Dean Skinner, actually. Not just, well, like, not just Afra, but like, it's kind of this, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, be my agent and spy on Skinner. But in return, you'll be getting access to these books.
Well, not so much Skinner as, what's the Russian's name?
Kirill Baranov?
Yeah, they're very concerned with him, too. Like,
yes.
They're very concerned with the concept of Russians in general getting access to body swapping. Like, again, like an interesting kind of idea presented as part of this is this whole idea that, like, hey, through the eyes of the KGB versus CIA type of stuff, what does hypergeometry manifest itself as? Oh, it's the ultimate spy tool type of thing. It's a very limited, very kind of, I don't want to say human, but kind of very like as a tool look at mysticism and magic, where it's like, yeah, you could probably do something equivalent to an atomic bomb with hypergeometry, but the more practical aspect usage of it is body swapping, and that'd be far more problematic.
Well, I mean, you have Spectre, who is a specialist on like esoteric metaphysics and everything else like that. That's a government agent who is now in trying to prevent a magical arms race.
Yeah,
like it makes sense. It makes sense, and the fact that you already have an agent, I guess, or somebody who's done a couple investigations for you in Afra, you have your team basically.
Criminal informant's probably the right phrase for her at that point. Yeah, because she's, I'm not sure I'd say a willing participant, but also, yeah, stuff like that. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back aspect of that. But yeah, so get back onto our summary aspects of this. This is where we meet, I think, both Jad and Mai's favorite character in the entire book, both as she exists at this point and as she exists later on, Professor Trumbull, who is a professor of mathematics, technically, at Miskatonic University. She is the first female teacher there, which is a big deal.
It's not just mathematics. Professor Catherine Trumbull is the first woman who is teaching multi-dimensional geometry at Miskatonic. Like, she is out there doing some weird shit. Because multi-dimensional geometry, like, she has not really a major interest in multi-dimensional geometry. She's just more interested in the math. All the other professors just are like, oh man, check out this like folkloric stuff or whatever the heck. And she's a little bit more dismissive on the concept of it or like the subject of it. But again, like, I don't know if that's 100% her opinion or...
Yeah, so I guess to kind of like flash forward a little bit in the story, but I think it's important at this introduction. At the time Trumbull is introduced, she is actually a Yith or Yithian, the great race of Yith, in a human's body, which is, I don't want to say one of the lesser known kind of mythos things, but definitely lesser utilized. They're a little bit more complicated from a tabletop RPG and lore perspective. They are things that live at the end of time or kind of beyond the end of time and view time as a grid and travel back in time to kind of archive and record the real history of the world. And because they exist way the hell at the end of it, they know the future from the point they're at too. Like, Yiths don't work in chronological order. A Yith might kind of observe a time period, in the year 50,000 AD, and then for the hell of it, go back to like before Common Era year 3. And that's not a problem to the Yith, but now because they are Yith, they have the knowledge from both points in time type of thing, which kind of plays out as like you can ask a Yith about the future, and they might tell you. They might not give you a useful answer about the future, but they will tell you about it. They're kind of one of the more, I don't want to say neutral aspects of the mythos when it comes to kind of eldritch beings, but they're just kind of there doing their thing. They don't want to, they have a larger kind of story in the greater mythos about how like they're kind of just waiting for cockroaches to take over because humans wipe themselves out. And I guess an important detail to bring up is the fact that like just because they know how things turn out doesn't mean they're great on the exact timetable of it. It's kind of always in flux, hence the needing to record and update and make kind of changes to it. And I think one of the things the story does really well is actually kind of the horror of the Yith in some way. I think kind of it writes that aspect of itself very well. I'm getting ahead of myself, but yes. Trumbull is a Yith in a human's body using this access to observe. They are the Yith at that point in time whose job it is to observe Miskatonic University, a point in time in the universe worth observing because lots of stuff keeps happening. They're worth observing type of thing.
Well, I mean, she's also trying to make sure that the records of Innsmouth is recorded, I guess. In Wintertide, the religion kind of worshipping Cthulhu, worshipping Nyarlathotep, like the reverence of these eldritch gods, it's called Aeonism, and the people of the water revere the Yith as just great beings. And so I believe it's in like chapter 3 or 4. It's pretty early on in the book where Trumbull reveals to Aphra that she is a Yith. And kind of that creates the really like a really intense relationship between Trumbull as well as Aphra, because Aphra is here to do something. She has a goal and whatnot. Trumbull exists. She's lesson planning. She's also giving like little bits and pieces of advice to Aphra, but ultimately she's not here to help Aphra whatsoever. She's here for her own specific reason.
Yeah, she's just kind of there by pure circumstance type of thing. It's not she's not there to help or hinder. It's just like, oh, you also happen to be here. Neat, I guess. This might be interesting and worth recording. Yeah, I guess like it's worth bringing up that like the Yith value knowledge, and that's about it. And I guess when we're talking about this, like on paper, the Yith don't seem like to be that kind of horrifying a thing, except for the fact that like Yith are immortal, not because they're immortal, but because like when they get close to death, they'll just jump into the body of one of their younger offspring and take that thing's life, basically.
Or straight up, not even their younger offspring, but if they're experiencing an extinction event, the Yith will just straight up take over an entire species.
Yeah. The Yith are survivors. Like it's not made a big deal of it, but like the Yith, against your will, swap into your body. Your mind and essence and soul or whatever kind of gets to go to a kind of interesting place and enjoy the insane library of the Yith, but none of this is consensual. It's very much against your will, and also the Yith seem to kind of focus on people that either would be in positions that are beneficial to them or have intellects or mindsets that make them more compatible with the Yith, hence why Trumbull is such a good candidate, because she already kind of has the math of a wizard magician, for lack of a better phrase, making her more Yith compatible. And take this back to kind of the spy aspects for a quick second, a better cover. Like a professor already interested in hypergeometry and the math of that, if they suddenly become a little bit more interested in that, no one's going to bat an eye. It's just, oh, they're more into their job now, I guess.
Also, the prejudices of Miskatonic University with the only woman professor, they will not recognize the fact that she's just had a drastic personality shift.
Yeah. Lady troubles and whatnot.
At one point in time, they did question whether or not she was in hysterics. And I was just like, ugh, to a Yith.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, when they're at Miskatonic, Caleb has met them. You also are introduced to the kind of spy informant that is there that's blackmailing Dean Skinner. Dorothy Dawson, who kind of becomes part of the Scooby Gang, for lack of better terms. But the last person that is introduced and kind of helps keep the plot moving forward is Audrey Winslow.
Who is part of a... Would calling it a magic polycule be a correct label for that situation?
A magical polycule. The official term that they refer to is a confluence. Just as the story progresses, those who are within almost like a coven, or at least like magic practitioners in Aeonistic magic, is called a confluence. Audrey is interesting because she's actually not a student of Miskatonic. She is a student of Hall, which is I
think it's literally described as the sister university of Miskatonic. Like it was initially for the women folk to go to if they wanted to pursue higher education, as most Ivies have a legacy with, and now it's kind of the less stuffy sibling to Miskatonic.
Yes. Because with the characters that are introduced with Audrey, you have Jesse Sadler, Leroy Price, as well as Sally Ward. Audrey and those three are just kind of like a secondary group that runs into Afra and her group, and some of the character tension starts building through that.
So I guess kind of bounce around a little bit because this book is worth bouncing around on some. Of the four characters that are kind of part of this little group, you have two men that are kind of into the magic for the power, one woman who kind of just seems to be along because her boyfriend's into it, and then what's her name, Clara?
Audrey? Wait, hold up, Sally?
And then you have Audrey, who's just kind of actually interested in all this stuff and is maybe the best out of all four of them at stuff.
She's the most real. I mean, it talks about her connections with her parents, and she definitely is aware of the fact that she is a woman and plays off the fact that she's a young woman. She's not afraid to use her feminine wiles to get through guards or get through any kind of like defense or anything else of sort. And so she'll take any advantage that she has and she'll utilize it. She is ambitious.
To a fault, but we'll touch on that in a few minutes. Yeah, so they get introduced, they kind of get knocked around a little bit. Through them, we learn about, hey, there's maybe this Russian guy that was studying at the Hall School, which then leads to another kind of repository of Eldritch books and whatnot, which then leads us to our first deviation that we never fully recover from in the plot, to another Deep One survivor, or Innsmithian survivor of the raids that wasn't quite rounded up, who was very involved in body swap.
Audrey suggests that they check out the Hall collection of materials as well. And from there, you learn that the librarian knew Afra's not distant relative, but family relative.
An aunt or something, like a second cousin, I think.
Kind of. You learn about Asenath Waite, who, if you are familiar with the thing on the doorstep, is the daughter of Ephraim Waite. So the fact that Afra Marsh is not only a Marsh, but also a Waite kind of ties in a little bit more. It's super funny the way that the librarian kind of talks about Asenath. It sounds like she had a crush on her, but the way that it was relayed that she found Asenath just absolutely mystifying was kind of funny to me, because it states like she made you feel, she was hypnotizing. She made you feel like you were something else or someone else. And I was like, ha, 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 body swapping. You probably at that point in time can think like, oh, wait, was that Asenath or was that Ephraim? Either way.
My understanding is that like the entire time the physical body is out of Innsmouth, the entire story about that, it's actually her dad body swapped into her. Like, that's, yeah. Because
they also find out that there is a survivor, Derby, if I recall correctly.
Sounds right, yeah. Again, a best friend married our body swapper, and best friend, this guy's best friend figured out something was up, and I don't remember the exact kind of situation, but is the murderer of both of them technically, but his story is crazy, so he gets locked away in a sanatorium and left there to rot, basically.
By the time that Edward Pickman Derby had shown up, Ephraim had forced Edward into Asenath's body and then took over Edward's body. So Ephraim is now in Edward's body that's inside, that's being institutionalized.
And if you're sitting there wondering why me and Chad are stumbling over this, it's because none of this actually matters in the grand scheme of the book.
It's the tie-in that like ties it all into the mythos or whatever.
Yeah, it is a kind of weird aside that ties the book more firmly into the larger lore, which is a topic we will talk about. But I guess it also does establish just how potentially dangerous and ruinous body swapping is. It does kind of flat out state that the Deep Ones think the art of body swapping is super fucked up and wrong and against everything they believe in, and you shouldn't do it, and a variety of other things. And kind of, if I'm being a little disingenuous, it's a very long way of saying the Deep Ones don't like this either, and maybe we're not so different across the span of like 50 or so odd pages that don't actually add much to the story. But it's a neat aside, I guess. I at this point in the story was really hoping this was going to become more of a thing, like maybe our body swapper was still out there, maybe he was in the Russian now or something. But also, this is about the time where the body swapping story or part of this story gets, I don't want to say completely dropped, but this is kind of the last time it's cared about in a meaningful way.
The body swapping stuff was really just kind of the vehicle from getting from one place to another. Whatnot. The body swapping plot is ketchup.
Sure.
It is the vehicle that gets the French fry to your mouth. Like,
yes,
it is. It's there because
wouldn't that be the French fry in that case? Because the ketchup is what's carried on the French fry.
I don't know. I English is not my first language.
Fair enough. Yeah. My point being, like, it's, if you bought into the story for kind of an interesting spy story, this is where that stops being that and the rest of the story begins. And we will talk about that in greater detail later because I have issues with it because I like the spy story parts. But yeah, so
I feel like it's still continued. I mean, like right after Hall, you're introduced to the rival FBI group, who is Phil Spector's either old coworkers or just people who are also in his department that he just doesn't like. You have George Barlow, Virgil Peters, as well as Mary Harris.
Sure, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit on that.
Oh, my apologies. I thought it was like, for whatever reason, I thought after the Hall is where they end up getting caught up in that because Trumbull tried to hypnotize
two kind of important things happened before that.
My apologies.
Yeah, so the two big events I was alluding to is that prior to our next round of FBI agents showing up, the Deep Ones show up.
Oh, yes. They do a summoning to call the Deep Ones.
I mean, there's the summoning, and then there's the field trip. Or did I get that order swapped?
No. It was I think it was the field trip that was the cover for the summoning, because that's why Jesse, Leroy, and Sally wanted to come along too, as well as Audrey. But Audrey was like, "Hey guys, don't show up, because please don't show up. You don't ruin this for me. I want to be part of this group." But
we were getting ahead of ourselves for a brief second here. Yeah, so Scooby Gang loads into the car, goes off to the beautiful Innsmouth shore, and contacts some Deep Ones. We get a interesting family reunion between Afra and Caleb and their grandfather, and you get your first kind of taste of more, I don't want to say traditional, but kind of what you'd expect for Deep One writing. They are large, terrifying fish people. You get kind of an interesting look into Audrey's mind, where she is not into these fish people, but like only Charlie is the only human character there smart enough to be like, do you not get how fucking dangerous this situation is? Like, every single one of them could kill us with their claws, with their magic, with their tridents, without even trying. And Trumble's there being smug Trumbull.
Well, I mean, like, she's also just kind of like, oh, hey, more of these guys. I wonder if I could talk to them and just kind of figure out why the fuck they let their entire archive be taken.
Yeah, and I guess also around this time we get the story from Trumbull about the children of the sea, air, and stone, dirt, mountain.
Children of the earth.
Earth, that's what I was looking for.
Children of the earth, yes.
Which is not explained yet, but will come into play in a little bit. But yeah, so as part of this, our reverse Scooby gang, the remnants of our magic polycule show up and someone gets injured. I enjoy the fact that kind of the New England tradition of making up giant dogs that attack people gets brought into this. I thought that was a fun little, someone from the Northeast. I enjoyed that kind of being a little fun callback they threw in there.
Is that a thing?
Oh, yeah. We have a fucking way too many stories about giant dogs attacking people.
It's a
thing. It's a thing.
Okay.
It is a thing.
The most recent, like my largest, I guess, East Coast influence is my 8th grade Washington, D.C. U.S. history trip. So everything is filmed, viewed through the lens of that. And that was like back when Bush was still president. So I have a very, very poor understanding of not California, I guess. Like, I'm just learning about the power of Dunkin' Donuts and why Dunkin' Donuts is more prominent on the East Coast than Starbucks.
Yeah, yes. We think of Starbucks as fancy.
All right.
Yeah. But that's in no way related to this book. So we digress and move on. But yeah, so as part of this, we get injured, some mind wiping, and
not just mind wiping, but Afra specifically ties herself to Sally. She uses like a sigil on her arm or something like that, so that way she could use Sally as like a means of like spying. I believe it's a spell that will warn her for betrayal.
Yeah, or something of that gist at least.
Yeah, it'll come into play It'll come into play like in the 3rd act, but that sigil is kind of important.
We get that, and we then head back to Arkham. And does the ritual happen? Did the FBI show up because of the ritual, or my memory of this is that kind of the weirdness happens, then the FBI agents show up. I could be wrong about that.
The weirdness happens, and then when they're trying to get back, the FBI agents start showing up because Charlie's plan is not happening fast enough. So they sent in...
Not Charlie, Spectre.
Oh, Spectre, sorry. Spectre's plan is not happening fast enough, so they send in a second team to get results. And that's where Trumbull tries to hypnotize a guard, and then everybody gets black bagged. And you find out that these FBI agents are kind of competent because they have amulets that are like taking the brunt force of the Yith magic.
This is where the Delta Green starts kind of seeping in. And again, I got really excited because I'm like, oh shit, competent FBI agents that then kind of fade to the background once their point in the story is over. But
no, but they're like really competent, specifically Mary, because Mary is just like, yeah, I just researched this and I just fucking hodgepodge this shit like into existence.
I appreciate that they're kind of like, why are you so bad at this? Like, why? This is kind of my memory of this maybe being a little bit faulty. There is the communication ritual that happens that is done by the dean that kind of pokes a hole in reality that then leads to the rest of the book. I thought that happened before this, but apparently it happens after.
That happens at the end of the 2nd act, basically.
Okay, yes. This is the end of the 2nd act, yeah.
Yeah, the first summoning was to call the deep ones, and that's where everyone at the beach, and that's where everyone was like, okay, here's the inner sea. And then that's where the hints of Audrey's true lineage kind of pops up. Actually, that's exactly where they find out, because Trumbull's just like, oh, you're Kinyan. And Audrey's like, what the hell is that? It's like, well, your people are known as the mad ones who live under the earth. And she gets super fucked up over it.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. Yes. Yeah, so FBI agents show up. Trumbull realizes her cover's blown and books it at that point, setting up kind of a mentor void that will propel the rest of the story forward. Spectre gets chewed out a little bit. The FBI is now here, or at least written as though they're here. They flex some muscle, flex some amulets, intimidate some hybrids, and then everyone just kind of goes home with a stern talking to.
They end up regrouping because they need to now deal with the fact that the other FBI agents are working against them, or like kind of it's a small personal arms race to find out like what's going on, because they're still there to find out where this Russian spy is. but also they're fucking around with the ability for them to look into the Innsmouth archives. So at that point in time, they're trying to hide their true goal in taking back these tomes or so. But
well, it's complicated because Afra and Caleb's goal is these books are ours. They belong to us. Y'all stole them. You should give them back. Slightly more Caleb's than Afra's. Afra's just kind of happy to have access to, in a couple cases, the literal family diaries and whatnot again. Like, it's both of them approach it from kind of a reclaiming your culture and history standpoint. Afra's just kind of happy to be at them again. Caleb's much more in the, yo, how are we going to steal these?
I also forgot to mention their grandfather was like, hey, so are you guys going to rebuild Innsmouth? Are you two gonna breed together, or like are you gonna find other mates and stuff? Because what's up with our breeding grounds?
I'm not being crass when that entire section basically is just a large fish person tried being like, so
I want grandkids. What's up with that?
I want grandkids. Y'all fucking right? Like, I don't care who with, but like, I want them grandkids.
So there is that additional kind of push for them to regain access or regain control of these archives and whatnot. There's a couple scenes here and there where Jesse, for whatever reason, shows interest in Afra or interest in like wanting to breed with Afra at the secret non-denominational Cthulhu shrine that's hidden inside the chapel at Miskatonic.
We kind of glazed over this because it wasn't super important, but like, a reoccurring theme is that maybe not Caleb, but we also don't know this because it's not from Caleb's perspective, but like Afra, quote, looks Innsmouthian. Like, people keep coming up to her being like, ma'am, are you from Innsmouth? And I don't know, is there any more of your kind out there still type of thing? Like, she has the, as numerous characters put it, the Innsmouth look, which she's self-conscious about, but I don't know. It seems to kind of like fluctuate throughout the book how prominent it actually is and what that actually means. But yeah, it's there, at least in Jesse's case, he seems attracted to her only because she is Innsmouth. If that makes any sense.
The fetishization of exotics, especially just because like it is his field of study. It is what interests him.
Sure.
The magic and everything else of sort. But they are also looking for a very specific book, or they're just kind of looking for more deeper knowledge. I think it was more of the more magical tomes that'll kind of get them, it'll kind of propel their confluence more. And so they try to break into the Miskatonic archives, if I recall correctly.
It sounds right, yeah.
Yeah, they try to break into the Miskatonic archives and they kind of find a couple things, but then like the alarm goes off. And because of the fact that the books were being accessed out of the special interest library, or the books were being accessed out of office hours, so suddenly that stuff just gets shut down. And from the special collection, and because the fact that they have no access to the special collections library, they're trying to find other ways to kind of get around that. And that's where the other FBI team uses their inventory spell, and oops, we accidentally summoned a demon.
Not so much a demon, like, so
not a demon. Yeah, it's not a demon, but they summon something from beyond this plane of existence.
Yeah, I guess kind of a thing that the book on numerous occasions reiterates is that, like, us as humans' understanding of the old ones and the outer gods and whatnot, it's flawed and wrong. And I'm not saying it's not to a certain extent. Hail Nyarlathotep, but yeah, may his darkness reign for eternal. But yeah, anyway,
I, Nyarlathotep, keeper of the knowledge.
That's more of Yog-Sothoth, opener of the gate. But I think it's implied to be Yog-Sothoth they can have in contact with. But throughout the book, the idea of the contact spells is brought up, where kind of it's the don't make the mistake of contacting something bigger than you. And a theme and kind of idea of outer gods and kind of old ones is that a lot of bad stuff happens not because they're inherently evil. It's because getting the attention of one of these things is bad. And because they are human's the wrong phrase, but like sentient and not just a force of nature, you can get the attention of them. And you do that by kind of punching a small hole in reality. And doing that to contact a deep one or even kind of like something that's had higher up the food chain, not a problem. It's only so big. It can get into reality. But when you phone a friend and call Yog-Sothoth, it's capable of kind of holding that hole open, and it's not trying to squeeze through, but it's kind of, for lack of a better phrase, radiation is leaking through and causing problems. Like the hole it's holding open, not even consciously, just kind of because it is what it is, causes problems.
I think the way that they were describing it was that like these other beings aren't, yeah, they're not necessarily evil, but the mere existence of the mere proximity of people or our plane of reality to their existence causes some really weird shit. They're just moving from one place to another because something happened or they have an interest. And the wake of their existence in our reality causes us to go crazy.
They're curious even. It's like, what's this over here? I've never noticed it before. An entire dimension. Ooh.
Oops, my mere presence and aura is causing you to just keep rolling D6s.
Yeah, the phrase I often use when I, not to kind of take us on a whole side tangent, but like what I like about Eldritch horror, specifically kind of Eldritch gods and whatnot, is that like they relate to the Chernobyl disaster in an interesting way, where it's like radiation's not malicious, it just is, but it being out of its box is the problem type of thing. And the simple kind of like proximity of these things is the problem. Like it's truly a, maybe we shouldn't have built a bad reactor, but now that the roof's off the building, the blue light's coming out, and that's the problem. It's easy to be like, oh, that evil radiation, but the radiation's not doing anything. It has no consciousness. It has no malice against you. It just exists. And unfortunately, it existing is dangerous to everything and anything around it. And that causes problems because it is so much more powerful than you're capable of withstanding type of thing. And that's a long tangent. We can explore other places at some point in greater depth.
You're kind of blowing my mind because like I've never really thought about the Eldritch gods in relationship to radiation, because in my head there is some sort of just ironic comedy in the concept that, hey, that me standing next to this rock is poisonous and it's dissolving my organs. Why? How? Like the fact that that exists and the fact that that could happen to me is nutty. And the fact that we in our hubris is like, let's do it. Let's harness this power, this poisonous aura rock.
Not to put us off into a total tangent while we're talking about a book, I think one of the best written modern Eldritch horror stories is actually the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. Like, it's not, there's no Cthulhu, there's no Yog-Sothoth, but like the tone and the presence and the personification and the way it presents radiation as an evil force, but not like not evil, but like a force, I think is one of the best examples of how to write this type of horror, actually. Like it is unfeeling presence that doesn't hate you, but wants you to die with every aspect of its being.
Yeah, no, that is exactly the vibe that I got while watching Chernobyl. Fuck. But yeah, anyway, so
yeah, back to Wintertide.
Back to Wintertide, they get inventoried, and by they I mean Afra, Audrey, Caleb, and Trumbull somehow end up in the basement of the library or some sort of like it's some sort of supply closet, and inside is government counter Scooby Gang, as well as rival Scooby Gang, who are trying to figure out like, why the fuck did it catch you? Oh wait, no, you're in Smithia, and Audrey, what the fuck is up? It's like I'm a dirt child. And then while that conversation is happening, things pulse. Something moves inside the room. Trumbull banishes the otherworldly presence, but not without a cost, because it sticks inside Sally and it sticks inside Audrey. Or it kind of sticks inside Audrey, but also Audrey's secret genetic failsafe starts popping up, and she starts slowly turning into a mad one. And so we have Sally, who's like dying of a frost, an unknown frost, and Audrey, who's slightly going insane, and then Trumbull, who after this situation turns Mary illiterate, just takes over her body. It's like, I gave you alexia, I believe it is, where you can just no longer read or understand symbols, and then dips, like just straight up yiths out of
the yith in Trumbull. Trumbull's still there, and you get kind of the interesting horror of actual Trumbull coming back and having to deal with the fact that the yith has just fucked her life up in every way, shape, or form.
Fires are made. There's people, just random ass people living in her house. She sees class notes and notes to herself in Enochian.
There's even some implications that she wasn't even teaching at Miskatonic before the Yith showed up. I don't think that's true, but there's a way of reading it where it's like, what do you mean I teach here now?
No,
yeah, I know.
Like, she was like there maybe for like a year or something, and all of a sudden a Yith realizes like, yo,
it's useful. I know. I prefer the idea of that one, I guess. Yes. Take it to
I'm employed?
Extreme. Yes.
But she's been out for like 6 months, they say.
Yeah.
But she has spent 5 years in the Yith's original body, exploring the archives, and just maybe having loose memories of her Yithian experience that only are summoned up through, frankly, ADHD means. Like, you kind of get an aspect of it because someone was like, oh man, this Yith, like, what do we even call them or whatever? Because Trumbull is feeling very uncomfortable with them calling the Yith her name. But she says like, oh, and she like races her arms like pincers and tries to pronounce the Yithian name, but she cannot physically do so because her body just cannot make those noises. Also, look up what a Yith looks like if you're going to be reading this, because I think it's like a really great visual to understand just how horrific Yithian physiology is comparative to human physiology, and trying to like marry the concept of like, this is what body swapped.
There's also an implication that that's not even the Yith's original form. That's a whole larger
that's
topic.
like a species that they took over, because Yith just takes over species sometimes.
Yeah. But yeah, that's beyond the scope of Wintertide. So yeah, this is kind of, let's kick the summary into high gear to kind of get through this. We can talk about the more fun parts of this. But yeah, so this begins kind of the falling action of the book, which, to speed through it some, Scooby Gang goes back to Innsmouth. Grandpa shows up. Grandpa can fix this, but maybe there needs to be a blood sacrifice. The magic Innsmouth blood sacrificing knife is still somehow in the fucking Innsmouth church. Not my favorite part of this book, when just kind of stuff starts falling into place. Turns out human Trumbull's mathematical mind is super useful for hypergeometry. Deep One's teach her some shit. They enact a ritual because they've kind of had a coven has a bit of a soul bond thing going on at this point. They kind of have intermingled spirits, so they can kind of cleanse each other some through the inner sea. Afra is capable of cleansing out the infections, and everyone is saved. And I'm glazing over a lot, but a lot of stuff gets said and not.
Sally dies.
Yeah. A bunch of unimportant characters get yeeted out of the book completely. Blood sacrifice must be made.
And then they are given like, hey, so like, let's make babies, right? So you're going to make babies. What's up with that? And then the second book happens.
Yeah, the book ends with the implication of like, hey, maybe we should rebuild Innsmouth. And if they do that, maybe the Yith will like help get the books back to Innsmouth, because it sure looks like the humans shouldn't have them, but also it's open-ended. This was not written as initially kind of a series, and it ends kind of Afra's gonna stay in the area for a little bit longer, maybe go back to San Francisco, maybe not, type of thing. Neko is happy to have been out in the world. I think she goes home at the end, right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Not to harp on this too much, it has a very, and then everything worked out and all the people that were important were fine, except Sally, who is dead. But her sacrifice was not in vain because all the important people survived. Yada, yada, yada.
Well, I mean, like, there's still just kind of the anxieties that drive
Sure,
Afra,
yeah.
and the anxieties that are now like within Audrey, which is going to be the leading anxieties which propel the sequel story and whatnot.
Which is beyond the scope of this book, unfortunately. Yes.
If you're interested into reading it afterwards, I have read it. It was, I don't think it was as characteristically deep or involved as this. It felt a little bit more science fiction action adventure rather than investigative hijinks. But again, scope of the book. I personally really enjoyed this book just because I really like character dynamics, interpersonal relationships and interiority really kind of drive plots for me. The interiority that you experience from Afra is absolutely phenomenal, in my opinion, just because she's really trying to not cope, but just really trying to process the fact that she is an inheritor of these. She's an inheritor of the future of the Children of Water. But the future of the Children of Water, being a deep one, comes with a lot of set in stone.
Yeah. So before we kind of get into this, let's do a quick one on this one. So we're going to talk about this in depth. We're going to touch on a bunch of stuff. If you're looking for kind of a quick, what did we think of the book? Chad, what'd you think of the book?
It's a slow-paced, character-driven work. I think it's really phenomenal. And as a playground of introducing ideas regarding what it means to be human in another sense, trying to marry the idea of being human but also having like these otherworldly expectations. It is a really interesting thought experiment that catches my attention specifically. Hopefully it does the same.
I do not like the book. I will admit that the more time I have had away from the book, my vitriol has subsided some. We'll get into this kind of in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. I think it misrepresents the mythos at every turn. I think it kind of props itself up by attaching itself to Shadow over Innsmouth and then does nothing with that connection to justify its existence. Like I said, kind of as we're going through it, it kind of has various plots that pop up and then go nowhere, and I do not like the ending. But that being said, I have mellowed on the topic. Coming off this book, I was angry at the book, if I'm being honest. Like I had a lot of...
You were heated.
I was heated, and we will talk about that some, but kind of as I have had some distance since then, I have mellowed some into, I just don't think it's that good. I'll give it points, though. It got me heated, so maybe it did something right in that category. But yes, if you're looking for kind of the quick summary of that, without us talking in depth about Lovecraftian bullshit or H.P. Lovecraft, or kind of like what we think you have to keep in mind when talking about this book, that's that. We hope you enjoyed. The next book is Mr. Magic, Mr.
Magic.
Mr. Magic. Read it. It's totally different. It's I'd say it's kind of King and Yellow-ish in tone, I guess. Maybe is the right way of thinking of it.
I can kind of see that.
It's fun. It's a cool book about what if, in broad strokes, what if Barney was kind of an eldritch being, maybe or maybe not. No spoilers in that description. That's kind of what's on the back of the book. It's good. We liked it a lot, I think, both across the board.
Come on and zoom. And zoom.
Yes. Yeah. Join us next time for that one. But yes, let's get into Wintertide. And I don't think you can talk about Wintertide without talking about Shadow over Innsmouth and kind of simultaneously the baggage that comes with that, and how this book, using conveniences and contrivances, in my opinion, sidesteps any of that and suffers for it. Where to start with this, I guess.
I mean, like, you are more of the lore keeper than I am.
Of the two of us, I am much more engrossed in all of that stuff. And I think that is a positive and a negative for this book, because there's a kind of important detail that's in the Shadow over Innsmouth, not a Delta Green edition, not a radio play, not some reimagining version of this source material, that kind of fucks up the entire story of Wintertide. And it is that the Deep Ones murdered a fuck ton of Innsmouthians and then took over the town, and that's why the raid happened. And that's not some reading between the lines. That is flat out stated in Shadow over Innsmouth.
No, I guess the way that I approached this was kind of after you had made mention of it, and I was like looking through it and just kind of like reading more background information about like how Shadow over Innsmouth was just like Lovecraft being like, ugh, interracial relationships,
yes,
interbreeding, all this other stuff. Like in my head, and in the way that I'm seeing it, like the integration of deep ones as well as people, their mentions of hybrids and everything else like that. I don't think it really like it is mentioned, but I think it's presented as like this is an other world. This is like an otherworldly culture that exists not in either good or bad, but just exists as is. Much like the horror of like the Yith and how they constantly bring up like, oh, the Yith will, in order to preserve their race, will take over a species who have just discovered farming and is just thinking about civilization, and suddenly is thrust upon like a extinction event and whatnot. Like it exists as is. So it's I think though that yes, it is just glossed over because you gotta, I guess.
Well, let's get into that, I guess. Like, and I'm gonna be real generous in kind of the reality of how you can read Shadow over Innsmouth. Like, it feels weird to say it, but like ignoring the aggressive anti-Semitism present in Shadow over Innsmouth, because like Deep Ones are a Jewish allegory from H.P. Lovecraft, unfortunately. Like, they are blood purity, all that jazz rolled up into one very unfortunate mythos. So kind of choosing to not harp on that aspect of talking about Shadow over Innsmouth, let's talk about just the simple power dynamic of Deep Ones versus humans that exist in Shadow over Innsmouth. You have a group of people that are rich in gold that, through kind of intermediary, basically turn an entire town into breeding stock by saving the town from financial ruin. Again, that's not me being hyperbolic or putting a spin on anything. That's what this book says happened. Or that's what the story says happens. Sea Captain goes out, makes contact, trades gold with Deep Ones for women to make more Deep Ones. And there's some kind of weirdness about the fact that Deep Ones apparently can't reproduce other Deep Ones, but that's never expanded upon anywhere else. And I'm only harping on this much because, how do I put this?
You care about the source material.
I care about the source material. It means a great deal to me for a variety of reasons. I had to grapple with how I felt about H.P. Lovecraft as an author long ago, and I still grapple with it occasionally. And
as someone who reads H.P. Lovecraft, I would hope someone would grapple with the existence and just the person of H.P. Lovecraft.
Yes, I think
to read that source material uncritically, I don't think is healthy for anybody.
No, yeah, but people do, unfortunately, with some frequency, but that's a whole separate topic. And yeah, I think the kind of my biggest frustration with this book that kind of bleeds over into a lot of it is that it cherry picks aggressively what it does and doesn't engage with, which is fine and is within an author's right to do. It's their goddamn book. They can do whatever they want. No one would fucking read this book if it wasn't for Shadow over Innsmouth propping it up, though. And I'm not saying it has to be true to canon. It's a fucking novel. Like, both of them are made up stories about fucking fish people that live in a New England town, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not here going to try and debate the facts of like, well, actually, if you know the expanded lore, there's also Pacific Island Deep Ones and blah, 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 blah. I don't care about those inaccuracies. It bugs me a little bit that this book chooses to traffic in the expanded lore of the Cthulhu mythos without trafficking in all of the relevant parts of it, because there's generally accepted another little detail that the Deep Ones got up to during World War II, which was Nazi concentration camp related to. But again, not important to this book. That's kind of a larger topic about expanded mythos lore, et cetera, that it just chooses to sidestep, which is fine. It's the fact that it sidesteps what I think are some key important parts of the original kind of source material that are the reason you care about this. This is a sequel to Shadow over Innsmouth. not by H.P. Lovecraft. It's a reimagining, it's a repurposing, whatever you want to call it. It is still a goddamn sequel to that book, and I think it is shitty that it just kind of goes, these topics are too hard. Nope.
For me, it's okay. So, like, I understand that this is basically Wicked. This is H.P. Lovecraft Wicked, and it has a scope already of what it wants to talk about and what it aims to tackle. I think adding that into the narrative would cause it to be more complicated than it is, as it does have a lot of threads that is handled. Mileage may vary as to how you
badly. They're handled poorly.
Like I followed along. I think that things could have wrapped up a little bit more neatly, but I saw that it didn't try to carry a thread longer than what its intended purpose was.
Yeah, I guess my counter to that is it kind of like has three good ideas for a book it glues together, but never kind of fully fleshes any of them out into a full book. But because it glued three ideas together, it gets a full book out of it.
But nonetheless, for me, I guess inexperience, I read Wintertide before I read Shadow over Innsmouth, or at least I do believe that I read Shadow over Innsmouth like as a little bit of more of an uneducated reader way back when
it's like a teenager. We're old. It's been many years since we read it as teenagers, type of thing.
Yeah, but like in the context of being like part of the 4chan generation and being so actively ingrained in 4chan, like I've had to kind of repurpose and reteach myself a lot of different things when it comes to H.P. Lovecraft, to kind of revisit this and just kind of rethink, okay, so we have this concept in the stories. I'm vaguely familiar with Deep Ones. I really only kind of understanding that, okay, cool fish people, but to then be presented with Deep One culture, and then to then have to reconcile Deep One culture with the current culture that Aphra is being accustomed to, the experiences that she has now, kind of being apart from Innsmouth, having to be raised after like the decimation of like her culture and everything else like that. That is what it was engaging with me, because you have someone so far removed from, I guess, the horrors of that, now kind of coming back and having to negotiate with her grandfather about the ethics of restarting Innsmouth, the ethics that she now has because of her human air quotes experience. In this book, children of the water, children of the air, and children of the earth, aka Deep Ones, humans, and then the Kinyan or the Mad Ones, respectively, are humans. They're just a subspecies of humans, or they're just three branches of humans.
Aphra refers to herself as human multiple times throughout the book. It is a detail that I simultaneously appreciate, and it bugs the fuck out of me.
Well, I really appreciate that, because it's like she had like it's we are presented it as what it is written in Yithian archives.
Yeah, no,
as the Deep Ones being the longest living humans, they are the last people to see the sun before the Kutchakuk arrive. Who
cockroach
are
people? They inherit the earth.
They inherit the earth, yes. But yeah, like her desiring reconnection, but now facing the horrors of that reconnection. I love that dynamic. I love that kind of conflict.
No, I get where you're coming from. I do have an appreciation for that. I guess my issue is that, like, on paper, I don't hate the idea of the three branching human evolution. There is I got to assume it's conspiratorial science at this point. That's called like the sea ape evolutionary track, which I, along with many people back when Discovery Channel was disguising fucking bullshit science documentaries as, this is Discovery, it's real, put out a thing that basically was like, okay, yeah, like, here's how, like, if we wanted to explain the evolution of mermaids, here here's how it actually happened. Like, basically, what if some apes at kind of that pivotal point in human evolution realized that like man is getting crowded on the land and went back into the water and evolved into something more aquatically based. It's all I'm sure there's some not great conspiracy theories wrapped up in it, but yeah, the idea of humans branching off at that point and kind of way back, kind of primordial humans evolving along multiple evolutionary tracks that were more kind of situationally suited, I can get behind to a certain extent, appreciate, and I don't hate the idea of it's a clever explanation of why deep ones and humans are capable of interbreeding despite the numerous biological differences, like the fact that deep ones don't really age and they also can breathe underwater and that they are fish people. It gets a little kind of clunky when you start asking questions about it solves as many problems as it creates, or it creates as many problems it solves. I guess is probably the more accurate way of putting it. Like there's something kind of that the book touches on and then kind of, at least the way I read it, rapidly backs away from the fact that like deep ones, once they transition into full deep ones, can't reproduce, apparently. They can with humans, which means like let's take this to its logical extreme. That means kind of you have a unfortunately sexist kind of approach to women have a shelf life in this situation, because once they transition from a repopulation standpoint, they are no longer viable, meaning you still have hypothetically, literally ageless men hooking up with women that are being used to propagate the species. And then you also have the hybrid men that have not transitioned that are doing something similar that maybe you don't know you're about to give birth to an eventual fish child. And kind of introduction to the deep ones, the grandfather, all that aspects of it, surfaces this whole kind of icky topic where, and then very rapidly backs away from it, where it kind of plays it off as jokes. It's like, oh, this one will be feisty and fun. It's like, yeah, like in this book that's all about like, oh, we're all humans and stuff like that. We're not going to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about the fact that like you need capital H humans to keep existing and not the other way around. That there's something kind of predatory about that, at least in my reading of it. And that's kind of always been part of deep one lore, I guess, in my brain too, is that there is a semi-predatory aspect to them because they kind of need humans to keep going.
Well, I guess that's kind of also what sticks to in my mind is a line specifically from Afra, who refers to herself and Caleb as the last of her, or the last of the children of the sea, and the youngest of her kind. And like that's a finite line for her because she hasn't discovered anybody else within it. Because it also then just kind of leads into, all right, cool. She's literally the last facet or aspect before the age of the chicken. And I guess like it's part. I guess it's part of like any kind of nature in order, or any kind of natural beings or any living beings drive just to perpetuate existence.
Sure,
it's reproduction. It's just continuing and everything else of sort. It has that weird, uncomfortable concept of like, we wish to continue, but in order to do so, these are the terms. Because apparently, as a woman in Smithian, or as a healthy reproductive in Smithian, you hit menopause when you turn into a fish. But that's something I'm not educated enough to.
And it's never really explained, I guess, either. Like I kind of like, it's one of those ones where prior to this book, and if you'd asked me like, hey, can deep ones breed with deep ones, I'd have been like, well, I don't know, but like Delta Green says they can breed with fish, so it doesn't have to be humans, but like the ones you get from not humans have either brain damage or aren't fully functioning. Like they're revered in deep one society, but like they're not the goal, for lack of a better phrase. Like, but they also happen. So there's obviously some kind of reason for that, which then also like, and other stuff explores that too, where it's like, hell, even we've played around with this on negative modifier. Some like I had an alligator deep one at one point because I thought that kind of repurposing of one was a neat idea. Like despite kind of the very problematic nature of deep ones, they're a great monster. It's a very cool idea. It's a fascinating kind of reimagining of the kind of mermaid mythos, or the mermaid myth as something truly monstrous, which I like. It's a fun twisted version of that. And I do appreciate kind of Wintertide for taking that same reimagining and walking it back to probably an in-between point where it's like, okay, yeah, it's still a fucking fish monster, but like it's capable of perfectly human thought and normal reactions and is happy to see its grandkids and protective of its grandkids and says older Jewish person stuff like, so when am I getting grandkids or something like that or stuff like that. My critiques of the book are not to mean that I do not enjoy aspects of it or do not appreciate aspects of it. It's it all has a solid backbone of, I think if you kind of like, and maybe there's an argument to be made, this is an unfair thing to say, but I do believe it's true in this case. If you kind of reached into this book's soul and ripped out the Shadow over Innsmouth parts of it, there's not a lot of reasons to read this book. It doesn't add anything all that inventive. It doesn't do anything all that interesting. It doesn't have really that interesting a plot. It's purely this kind of core, spine, backbone, whatever you want to say, from a totally separate book that gives this book any reason to be interesting, I guess. And that's my frustration with it. Like, it's not the changing or repurposing of it. It's the kind of, I think of it kind of disingenuous use of something where it's like, it really does feel propped up as a result of it, to me at least.
Well, I mean, I guess my counterpoint is that it exists because of the Shadow over Innsmouth. It exists in response to. In order for it to exist, it has to have this specific back. And I guess the thrust of this would be to return to this setting and return to this situation, but with the lens of compassion. And like that's the compelling argument, I guess, for me to not just like enjoy this book, but to own a physical copy of it because space is so limited for me and everything else like that, to annotate it, to kind of revisit it.
Sure.
Technically, we've tried after the first debacle of recording this where like the audio had failed, whatever the heck. This is technically, I guess, my third or fourth reading of this as I was listening to the audiobook at work and then revisiting my bookmarks at home to kind of look into what's going on or like these key points or anything else like that. And like as I kind of come back to these characters, I get more invested in just the interpersonal relationships between Neko and Caleb's failed relationship that started in the camps to them kind of moving beyond that while Caleb becomes more situated into duty as well as letting his anger and letting his,
I'd say rightfully radicalized is probably a good read of him at that point. Yeah. Like
his radicalization kind of leads him into pursuing a relationship with Dawson as it becomes more mature and flirtatious. Neko hasn't really left home or anything else like that. She's still beginning to learn more about herself. Phil Spector and Charlie's kind of relationship beyond their professional one and how any kind of rumors or knowledge that can spring out of it can affect Phil's job when I believe Spectre makes mention of just like, I think in chapter 3 or something like that, his hesitancy or his being absent for a while because the state of Israel was officially just kind of created. And the United States is like, hey, what's your allegiance and stuff? And that's just a topic that the book does like, that's super messy. The book doesn't really dive into that. And I'm not even going to dive into that major conversation. It's more of like a character detail that affects him in a way.
I guess like we didn't talk about this as part of our summary. Like Spectre is Jewish, which as a Jewish person, I appreciate the detail of that while simultaneously going, okay, what does this mean in the grand context of things? And it's
the author is Jewish as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was just interesting the fact that like he just refused or he doesn't participate in any of the confluence circles until the very last moment because he's constantly making sure it's like, is this a religious thing? Or is this like a weird other practice that will then be acceptable for me to participate in? Have you?
How mystical is this? Like, we talking black magic right now? Or are we talking like laying of hands? Because I can do one of those two things. It's not the second one.
But yeah, and so Audrey, who is like my second favorite character, because Trumbull just as a dual character who exists outside of human scope and just acts in accordance to her specific goals. But then Trumbull coming back and just being somebody who's just caught up in an entire situation.
Yeah.
And just has to deal with like, well, I guess this is my fucking life now.
I think so. It's fascinating. I think because you and I both love the character of Trumbull, and like the more time I've spent thinking about this book, as I've said, I've had some we recorded this once and had a variety of audio issues, so now we're doing this again. And Trumbull is the best written character in the book by an unmeasurable degree, like to the point where I kind of wish the book was about her, because everything about her is more interesting to me as a reader than anything Afra does.
Because she's clearly defined.
Yeah.
Comparative to literally all the other characters who are just trying to figure it themselves out.
I think that's my problem. Like, I think it's this kind of awkward one where like there's a difference in my mind between well written and still trying to figure yourself out. Like, you can still be trying to figure yourself out and be better written than every character in this book is, except Trumbull. And at least kind of a lot of the details that you enjoy feel kind of like they're almost sprinkled on top of bad writing to kind of hide some of the bad writing, I guess. Like it's like, okay, it's like this character's not interesting, but if I throw this one detail on, it becomes suddenly this is that character, and that makes them more interesting. And when compared to Trumbull, that has facets, layers, not just one arc, but two arcs, dealing with the horror of the Yith, being a Yith, and is somehow consistently written across the entire book. It shows the weakness of all the other characters, I guess, to me, were just, it's like,
I see your point. Your point.
It's a very kind of utilitarian approach to characters, I guess. And like, not to kind of like backseat kind of drive this book. I think there's too many characters. Like, I think people get introduced and thrown out without any kind of real need to them. Like, in my notes, I literally just have the phrase, so was there even a spy? And
yeah, there was, funny enough, Afra just refused to tell, or didn't really want to tell Phil about it, because it was like, look, this happened so long ago.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, not really a spy, but it's, my point being, like, it's the, I kind of said this, like, it's three stories glued together in a very messy way that leaves me, at least as a reader, with no satisfying narrative to follow through. Like, I understand that the whole spy step is just to kind of get them from San Francisco to New England, and to a certain extent, I'm fine. It's the fact that, like, I like the spy story, and what replaces it never is as intriguing as the spy story. Like, the morphing from spy story to covert deep one that's body swapping, I can get down with that. I thought that was interesting. It's the, and now we're a story about the dangers of contacting elder gods. Okay, less interesting than kind of the whole body swapping thing, but okay, we're expanding the mythos, and oh, now just two people are infected because they touched an elder god. Okay, so you're gonna solve that or not, I guess. Like, that's kind of only the way the two ways go. There's no moral kind of questions or kind of criticism of that.
But like the ultimate conflict is solved through the relationships that the characters have developed within themselves. Which is I understand that is such a frou-frou, just like Chad really fucking answer, but like, I did like that this is not. Like,
I understand that, and from my perspective, the ending of this book was, and the power of Cthulhu was inside all of us all along, and Cthulhu's real name was friendship. How that fucking ending reads to me.
It's not even friendship, it's like connection, because like half the people don't even like each other.
That's true. Yeah, it's.
They're there to support each other through like what they're attempting to do. Mind you, like a lot of what I love about literature, a lot about books, narratives, and stuff like that stems from Chris Claremontian X-Men interiority panels. And so diving deep within like the mind of Jean Grey is like what's supporting the foundations of my interests. That's neither here nor there, but like that could kind of help explain.
Yeah, no, we are different people, because I understand that you look at this from kind of like the X-Men perspective, and I look at that ending from the Captain Planet perspective, where it's like, deep one, wild one, and I'm the human, and by our powers we make an ending, I guess.
But the book posits that ending is like is fine, but it's a conclusion that we can achieve. that it doesn't need to turn into an entire bloodbath or whatever, that we can use these softer features or these softer approaches.
Sure, but also Sally's dead at the end, and a blood sacrifice had to be made, and like everyone's just kind of okay with it.
It's still like they weren't okay with it. It was one of those things where it's like, well,
I said kind of okay with it, not completely, but like there's a woman dead in the sand here, and one of us is holding a bloody knife that's been used for decades for blood sacrifice and weird rituals. Like
I'm not saying it's softer than like it. Ultimately, it's still a fucking book about eldritch horrors and shit. But like,
yeah, and I guess like kind of like the jokes aside, like that's kind of some of my problem with it. Never picks a tone and sticks with it, and I understand this is a more kind of friendly. I even have a note saying very friendly, deep take on the deep ones. I get this. This is a what if it's not terror? What if it's kind of just embracing the other aspect of that? And if you can enjoy that, that's great. I can't get over the fact that there's a fucking blood sacrifice at the end and everyone's just like, yeah, I guess that had to happen. And like the other two basically human characters aren't just losing their goddamn minds at that point.
It's okay when Firestarter or like Sanguine does it, but suddenly when we're reading another book, it's an issue.
No, it's not. I play up the fact it's not. Like, I guess like maybe that's kind of my issue as someone who repurposes mythos all the time. I think it's just lazy. It's like, you just killed two people. Roll sand.
But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. That's really just kind of where it is. Like I understand and I see like why your criticisms are like you have strong criticisms, and I understand that this is not exactly truly cohesive book. It is a little bit more free flowy and everything else like that. I do appreciate that aspect of it. I do appreciate the fact that like the real drive and focus is characters, and like this is just things that happen to them, and this is just things that they experience. The softer ending is kind of almost like a relief in certain aspects when it comes to narrative drives, just because like I am also heavily influenced by Princess Mononoke being a very formative story to me. In aspect, like there was not really a giant ass battle where they had to kill a god or whatever have you. In the end, like the god was killed because his head was cut off or whatever the fuck.
But I mean, like it has. I remember that movie very differently. If you don't think there was a big battle where they had to kill a god,
like they killed a god, but like,
and they brought his head back. Spoilers for Princess Mononoke, I guess. But like, I guess like
spoilers for like a 2-decade-old movie.
Yes,
but you're like yes. So like there was like. Everyone had their own driving point. Like the iron, what was it? Lady of Iron Lady. I'm not talking about Margaret Thatcher. I'm talking about the bad bitch who ended up with only having like one arm.
Yeah. And I guess like my criticism is not, this is a character focused kind of free flowy thing, is that it's not great character writing either. Like I love Princess Mononoke and I understand the comparison you're making. There are some shared elements. Those characters are consistent. They grow, they evolve, their logic makes sense. Even like the eldritch unknowable deer god thing that shows up in that. I get where it's coming from. Humans fucking suck in that movie.
Okay, I'm just glad that I was able to get my point across and you were able to kind of connect with it, because I was like, I'm failing so spectacularly in explaining just how I relate character-driven stuff to Princess Mononoke. Like whatever. But yeah, thank you.
A lot of my issues just kind of stem from, I have lots of issues with this book. They stem from an appreciation for the mythos, kind of holding the expanded lore of this stuff near and dear to my heart, because I kind of have to, given the stuff we do for the podcast and whatnot. But also, like, for better or worse, the mythos means something to me. And maybe it shouldn't, maybe it should. I don't know. Like, I think it's interesting what people choose to latch on to as kind of part of that mental identity, but like it irks me when people do I love when people do a good job of fucking with the mythos. This is not one of those instances where it's just like it's one of those things where I just don't like the book. Like it's remove all of my criticisms of the mythos of it. Again, like it's using my same kind of thing of if you can rip the Innsmouth aspects out of this, my criticisms are still, I don't think the character writing is good. I think it's kind of incohesive. And yeah, it's
And that's valid.
Yeah.
And
No,
that's why I really appreciate just our polarizing opinions about this narrative.
appreciates the wrong phrase. I think it's an interesting, for a podcast that plays a lot of Delta Green, it is important that we talk about Wintertide. Not because I think Wintertide is inherently related to Delta Green, but I think it's important to represent a alternative mythos interpretation, if that makes any sense. A very different perspective than the one we normally play with. And kind of, I think it's, I guess, kind of transitioning now to our tabletop RPG discussion aspect of this. There are parts of this that, despite me having issue with them, I don't think are, I think are actually pretty good. Like, it can be repurposed and can be used. Like, I cannot overstate how just absolutely phenomenally I think this story nails the horror of the Yith.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the writing of the Yith horror, the kind of, like, again, going back to Trumbull is like the best part of the book, both as a Yith and not as a Yith. It nails that part of it so well. And like, kind of what I find a little bit baffling is nailing Yith horror is hard because they're not evil in the same way Cthulhu and a lot of the other mythos things are. They're just kind of careless, I guess is maybe the right way of putting it. Like, and if you're looking to use Yith in anything you're running, like your Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green, Path of Cthulhu, some other thing that uses the mythos, the way this book handles the Yith should be an inspiration. I think it handles it just so unbelievably well.
Can I read an excerpt from the book? Because this truly like jumped out at me and I just could not stop thinking about it. This is Afra speaking. Over the course of Earth's existence, 4 species served as their faces. And in each of those times, they record and preserve the history of our world, of every species that lives and dies here. I paused, angry again. Except for the species that will never live out their span because the Yith take it from them. When they've just discovered agriculture and are beginning to imagine cities, the entire species wakes one day in the distant past in alien bodies facing whatever threat the Yith deemed impossible to survive. Spectre swallowed visibly. That's vile. It is. And yet the 8 and more species whose memories they preserve cannot bear the idea of going unrecorded and forgotten. And I'm just like, oh my fucking God, the Yith?
Yeah.
She goes on even further later down the road because Spectre is just like, well, what if, like, the Yith, like, what if they could help with national security? And Afra is just like, are you fucking kidding me? National security?
They maybe don't even understand that concept. Like, it's so alien to them. It's like, it's body hop.
Yeah. And then another excerpt. The Yith don't interfere with the rise and fall of species, save the ones they take for their own survival. Their only interest in atomic war would be recording the arguments leading up to it before getting out of the way. The Yith have the power to bring down worlds, but they handle violent conflict by not existing in the place and time where it occurs. Like, it's, fuck.
Yeah, it's, like I said, the writing for the Yith aspects of the book is absolutely phenomenal. Like, anything you want to do using the Yith, take inspiration from this book. I think that part of it is fantastic. I cannot sing the praise of that aspect of the writing enough. And you've now heard me go on about what I think of the rest of the writing of this book, but we're in the tabletop RPG part of it. So kind of sticking with the tabletop RPG topic for a second.
Russian spies? Cold War with magic?
I mean, yeah, like, it's fucking Acton Cthulhu exists, but I don't think it's a very good game. I don't think it kind of captures the story of this. I think it's, if I was going to recommend a system to, quote, run Wintertide, for lack of words, I'd probably go with, like, Trail of Cthulhu or something. The Gumshoe system actually feels very up this kind of type of stories alley, where it's very kind of investigatory heavy and things just resolve and you have kind of insight points. Like, maybe something PBTA at that point as well. Like, I think kind of Monster of the Week might be okay for this type of thing. Like, a bit of a stretch, but Kids on Brooms, there's maybe a hack of that maybe works for this, given the kind of multiple Mystic Scooby games you have throughout this. I don't think, like, if you're looking to run this kind of friendlier mythos, I guess, I wouldn't go with Delta Green. I wouldn't go with Call of Cthulhu. I'm not sure I'd go with any of the kind of more playing up the horror aspect of it. Like, I don't know, a part of me almost kind of like thinks that there is a version of the mythos presented here that like belongs in your more fantasy facing tabletop RPGs in some ways. Kind of like presents a take where you could just have like a town of deep ones chilling in your D&D campaign or something, and your players probably know what deep ones are, your GM knows what deep ones are, and they're just not those deep ones. They're like helpful and are just like, yep, we're the fishermen that live up the coast from that other fishing village, and we engage in trade and whatnot, and yeah, things are pretty good. Okay, our daughters marry their sons, and our sons marry their daughters, and they go back and forth and whatnot, and we have a pretty good relationship. Why are you here exactly?
Well, I mean, I like the existence of Wintertide for me is like very the horrific aspects exist, but at the same time, you could still kind of have a compassion. Never mind. Like I'm gonna reel that idea back. I don't think it's fully fleshed out for me to speak about it.
So let me see if I got kind of where you were going with that. Like I think
there's these otherworldly existences that
so
and you could have a compassionate approach to it in the sense of like, okay, cool, we don't have to immediately jump into these horrors, but as you learn more about these people, like it becomes more of like a dangerous sort of like, should we really be diving too deep? Because there's aspects of this culture that just are just so beyond our understanding and our perspective, where we could establish friendly trade, but like, woof, there's other stuff that like might not be the most wise to engage in.
So let me tie this to a really weird comparison. Let's see if this actually makes sense by the end. One of my favorite tabletop RPG settings and kind of overall fantasy settings is the Warhammer fantasy setting. And partially because of how it treats dwarves. They are kind of more or less the token-esque version of. They're short, they have axes, they like to drink, etc., etc. But the setting leans very hard into what having kind of a heavy industrial race that lives for centuries, if not millennia, would do as a culture. And kind of one of the defining aspects of this is the fact that they are a culture of grudges, meaning that like a small slight against one person, like you are gambling with your friend Grom Ironbeard or something like that, and you can't quite cover your bet. Like you've been friends for a long time, you still get back to him the next day type of thing, and you just forget. And you owed him a copper or something like that, an insignificantly small amount of money, but still technically amount of money. Flash forward 300 years, and Grom Ironbeard's son, I don't know, something Ironbeard, is at your great-great-grandson's front door being like, yeah, so you owe us a shit ton of money because we've been racking up interest on you this entire time. And if you don't pay us, we're going to war, technically over a one goddamn copper coin. Because that's how this works. There's something, I guess, like it's the kind of the idea of the longevity and kind of the idea that you'll never fully understand that culture because you're not of that culture, and not from kind of a like outsider perspective, but because it really is alien. Like you are incapable of the mindset of that because like at a biological level, you will never be that. You can be as empathetic as you want. You can be as kind of culturally sensitive as you want, but like humans live 100 years, give or take, tops type of thing.
If you're lucky, or
if you're lucky,
depending.
In most of these settings, probably closer to 60, 70. But like just from a kind of like the ability to live for technically kind of ever is a huge societal change that like you'll never be able to fully comprehend, and like leads to a very different way of thinking about a variety of things that have rippling effects through just kind of all of your approaches to things.
But like argumentatively for me, the understanding of a compassionate approach to that otherworldly culture is not to dismiss it,
sure,
but to accept it as it is. So for like you as an adventurer to be like, oh man, that was like so long ago, yada yada yada, you're dismissing that dwarves culture, and you're just dismissing that there's like that's
a big
rules.
Point of the fantasy setting. I guess I should have gotten into that, is the fact that like the better written aspects of that are kind of like our characters. Like the best stories in that setting involving the dwarves are like human kings and whatnot that are like, oh, are super bad on that one. Yeah, no, we like we get this. Like our complete bad, we will make good on this. Like in that setting, fucking elves and dwarves hate each other have a long-standing feud, not because they're elves and dwarves, but because the elves were like, yeah, who fucking cares? And the dwarves were like, we do. This is honor to us, type of thing. That's enough Warhammer Fantasy for talking about Wintertide. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a kind of, I think that is kind of probably the best way of utilizing the book in some ways in kind of a tabletop RPG setting. Kind of, what would you call that in a kind of a snappy psychological term?
I mean, I always think of like the concept of just like radical acceptance.
Mm.
And it's not this like radical acceptance doesn't mean like you just accept your fate or whatever the hell, like, because you could fight against it, but like at the same time it's like it is what it is, and you just have to kind of cope around it or just kind of rationalize or figure out what the next step is. The presence of mind of just really just kind of creating conflict out of otherworldly customs and stuff, like that's just part of nature. That's just part of society.
Yeah, not true.
Like some people are going to be more comfortable with certain things than you are, and that is going to be fine. But at the same time, it's okay for it not to be, because it's like, well, how do you resolve this? What is the resolution?
Sometimes things aren't fine,
and yeah, and sometimes like things come to blows because these resolutions aren't, or these conflicts aren't resolved neatly. I'm not trying to say like, oh man, people like we're talking about like crafting a narrative and like to get messy with these aspects of fiction and to exercise these conflicts in a safe, where like as a player, like I am really engaged with Delta Green because I'm doing some dumb shit that I should not be doing on like a near, like every session, where I have to like fight my own morality, fight my own kind of immediate approach to resolving issues. I mean, I guess like it was just very funny the fact that when as players we get presented with, hey, you got to pretend to be ice agents, everyone was like, no, not right now. But later down the road, we're now building like ice agents as characters.
Yeah.
I am really engaged in wanting to create a law enforcement character because I really want to explore just my relationship with that. It's going to be very interesting on my end, but like, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, no, using that kind of a bridge to get back to tabletop RPG is a more narrow topic because we are a little bit all over the place on this discussion. I think there are two stories in the book worth salvaging. I think the actually kind of the body swapping spy story is a cool kind of seed for a story. I'm not sure which way you'd flesh it out. Like, I really do like the whole kind of deep one that swapped into human body to kind of escape persecution for swapping into bodies. I think that's actually a really kind of cool setup for things. And I think there's something there that could be played out in kind of both a Delta Green nihilistic or kind of Call of Cthulhu nihilistic approach, and also something more empathetic and less kind of the horrors of everything and whatnot. So like, I think you can kind of approach that from both sides. I also, I really actually like the whole kind of Ephraim Waite story. I think it's a hell of a setup. I part of my frustration with it feels like it's squandered without the book, but I think there is something definitely there where I love a good person that swaps into bodies multiple times to avoid death and kind of the consequences of their action story, kind of especially over time. I think it's one of the less utilized kind of supernatural things within kind of the stuff we like to play. I think there's a very relatable horror. And I think it's also one of those ones where kind of like it's very easy to kind of slip into the question of, yeah, if you could do this and you could get away with it because, well, no one else believes this is possible, would you do it? And I think it's a very good setup. I think obviously you could just play it straight as a Delta Green thing when the FBI shows up at the kind of midway point of the story. Like there's a natural incursion, something's broken free or something like that. Like get a compromised book repository, I don't want to say it quite writes itself because there's some details to flesh out, but there's plenty of investigatory hooks there you can play around with, both from a kind of civilians that maybe are responsible for that book repository breach, and now the supernatural FBI is there trying to lock them up versus being on the kind of law enforcement of it. Like, again, it's not a bad setup of, hey, there's been another breach at fucking Miskatonic. Oh, this is actually a problem. Shit.
Okay, question. What if like what if that was the hook? And the twist of the story is that because of the player's involvement, they stop the blood sacrifice or whatever the heck, and oops, that causes whatever was taken through the portal to stay, and it actually creates more conflict than they initially realized.
So there is a fantastic joke in at least the Delta Green community. I think it's less of a joke and more of kind of a slight criticism of the game, actually, in Call of Cthulhu, that every Call of Cthulhu module is just the prequel events to every Delta Green operation ever written. And
valid. Okay, fair.
Yeah.
Fair,
so to your exact point, it's like, you're normal humans. We've stopped the blood sacrifice. The Delta Green event that follows, you fucking idiots. There is still a fucking nightmare creature roaming the halls, but we stopped the blood sacrifice. Yeah, good job.
A banishment sacrifice?
Yeah. You should have let the wizards do their wizard shit, and then we'd have dealt with the wizards. Yeah, no, actually, to your point, like, that's if I was going to run anything from this, that either it would be the body swapping thing, or it would be the kind of, there's always kind of this interesting drive to do a Call of Cthulhu story with investigators and very human, very normal characters, and then have the Delta Green characters show up at the end and just kind of take over the cleanup, where it's like, oh, you fucking civilians, God, you were bad at this. It's like, we're here to help. We stopped the thing. Do you want a fucking cookie? Good on you.
It's the sequel to your game, is where you initially play a Call of Cthulhu game and then you immediately switch to Delta Green.
Yeah, it's something, it's honestly something we have in the works. Yeah, or it's kind of like the idea that, like, and 20 years later, the after effects of the player's conclusion now play out, because the number of, like, in the same way that the running joke in Delta Green is that, like, everything gets burned down by the end, so many shrines just blow up in Call of Cthulhu, and that quote fixes it. And if you're kind of looking at it from kind of a more macro perspective, it's like, so there's like 9 chunks of a magical artifact now, so I'm going to put back together, is what you're saying. And, like, over the span of 30 years, this fucking cultist guy that survived because he ran away could put those pieces back together, and we're right back at square one. Well, yeah, but, like, this happened in the 70s, so maybe it takes like 30 years, and then he's putting it back together. He's also become like some witch doctor or some like sorcerer CEO as part of this, and Delta Green's like, man, you're awfully good at this stock picking thing. Unnaturally good at it. What's your secret? Oh, this pendant I wear. Uh-huh, a pendant, you say? Sure would like to see that pendant. I don't know, just spitballing on that one.
Wow, obsidian.
Yeah. Man, there's a lot of blood on this obsidian. How do you pick your stocks again? And where do your interns keep going? Yeah, that's like a couple of at 2 seconds notice, I guess. Yeah, there is something there that, I guess, to kind of maybe close out the tabletop RPG thing aspect of it. From a pure negative modifier standpoint, there is a fun negative modifier story to be played out after the end of Wintertide, hypothetically, of just people being like, what the fuck happened here? No, what the fuck happened? I guess one of the fun details of the book that we glossed over is the fact they are redeveloping Innsmouth as like a World War II veteran housing project, basically.
Oh my god, yeah, I forgot, because we kept making jokes about them gentrifying Innsmouth.
Yes.
The second Dunkin' Donuts had been like built.
There is something fucking there in that, yeah. There's absolutely something there in.
That's why I had Dunkin' Donuts in my brain.
Yes, there's. Apologies. I may try and dig that clip out of the original recordings if I can salvage it.
There was something just so inherently hilarious to me about that. Caleb and Afra were like, "Shit, Innsmouth is being gentrified to become like a housing development and a new community and whatnot after everyone was being driven out." Like, I know Starbucks wasn't invented at that point in time, but like, damn it, they're going to install a Starbucks in Innsmouth. Was like a weird, it struck my funny bone in such a way.
Jad, it's Massachusetts. It's a Dunkin' Donuts. That's not the first one. It's the second Dunkin' Donuts. That's new gentrification has come.
Sorry, I didn't. I'm very unaware or ignorant to East Coast trends.
As this podcast
yes.
resident East Coaster, or as Masshole more specifically, we think of Starbucks as a fancy Pinkies Up coffee establishment. They are not as prolific on the East Coast as they are many other places.
Okay, so the second Dunkin' Donuts is being built in Innsmouth, where the preschool once stood, and Caleb and Afra are not.
No, it's going in the preschool. The preschool's still there. It just now happens to have a Dunkin' Donuts inside of it. That's how these things work. But yes, there is something there in, again, like you have something Cthulhu mythos, just the supernatural in general happen, and then just like things are fine, but then gentrification happens and that kicks all of it up. I don't know, there's something funny there to me, I guess.
Actually, no, that's so okay. So like I'm still thinking about like Red Hook, right?
Yeah.
Like and to think it's like, all right, cool. Hey, this building is being torn down and the residents are now being evicted from fucking Red Hook. But oops, it's the fucking initial building that got like absolutely fucked up in that initial story. And they want to build luxury condos or luxury apartments over it. Do you, as a player, let the developer destroy this building and maybe haunt like this new other building, or like how do you reconcile the fact that like this luxury apartment building is being built over maybe a nexus into a hell dimension?
But let's generalize it. Yeah. So you have this old building with a hell gate in the basement. What do you do?
Do you designate it as a historic landmark so that way it cannot be shut down or it cannot be like torn down? And like, because the fact that it cannot be torn down and now it's a government, whatever the hell, you can better monitor it or respond to it.
Do you hope that filling the bottom 3 floors with cement maybe fixes the problem? I like that idea, actually. Yeah, I like the. All right. Yeah. We should do something Red Hook related. There's some stuff to talk about there, I think. Yeah.
Like at some point in time, I really want to do like, because Ballad of Black Tom is a tiny little novella.
Yep. Maybe we'll do that after Mr. Magic. It'd be good to do something just kind of straight up Eldritch. I will say kind of the complexities and narrative style of this book do not make it quite as, put it in a very utilitarian phrase, harvestable as Crota was. I still think there's a couple kind of things that are good to pull from there. It's weird. Like where Crota, I think, had some very specific edge feels like the wrong phrase, but like direction and kind of like these are the obvious things you want to pull from this. I think in like some ways this book's more kind of like maybe this is the vibe you kind of emulate or something like that, or maybe this is kind of like this type of investigation is what you want to do, where it's kind of, I don't want to say lower stakes because it is still a fucking hole to something eldritch at the end of the book, at the end of this book type of thing, and people do wind up dead, but like nothing world ending, nothing that's gonna kind of like wipe out the town hypothetically on paper. Like it's more of a personal thing. Like maybe there's a Brindlewood Bay version of this that exists that's kind of someone's alley, I guess, at that point. Like,
well, I mean, like Crota knew that it was a 90s movie.
Yeah.
Trumbull knew that she was a Yiv. I think in this aspect, if you're going to be approaching this, like if you really want to kind of create this experimental field where your players can kind of tackle these like concepts and stuff, my personal relationship to canon is that canon is really just a tool for you to be able to push a narrative forward. Like canon to me is not sacred.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mentioned that. So now that kind of like, now that I'm thinking about this more, I don't know which is the correct game to use, and the answer may be none of them. This kind of feels like a World of Darkness / storyteller game, actually, where it's very kind of interpersonal, relationship driven, and
yeah, I see that.
Talky, if lack of a better phrase.
I see that because this is like I said before, this is a thought experiment. This is experimental in concept, experimental in approach. And I personally don't believe that when a narrative creates a question, it has to be answered. Because in essence, like we are now answering that for ourselves in this podcast, in this episode, and where we are talking about these concepts that the author is presenting.
No, and to kind of rewind back to some of the stuff that you really enjoyed about this book, I think that lends itself to kind of that World of Darkness style, like to take some of the things said at a very literal level, the kind of like, what does it mean to be human? What is a human in this setting? That is very much kind of that storyteller system style game, I guess. Like, am I monster? Am I man? Kind of thing. Like, what am I exactly? How do I feel about that? Like, and
how do I marry that with like who I am or what I want to be?
yeah, no, I think kind of like we joked about it some, I harped on it, but like I think kind of Afra's balancing of her duty to her duty to kind of Raulia as a deep one, her duty as a human who has connections to other humans, not just the Kodos, but other people that have treated her well, her rage at the people that treated her really shittily type of thing. Like, I think there is a interesting kind of dynamic at that point that, like, looking at Afra from kind of that game system's perspective feels, I don't want to say I like her more from that view, but I kind of get her more in some ways. I think like it's the first pass, or kind of like this is where you start and then you kind of play the rest of the game from there to build out that character. And I don't know, I think kind of like a World of Darkness style game where you're all deep one sounds kind of cool in a weird way, or Mythos creatures in general.
Like when you say that, and when you said World of Darkness, everything clicked because I was like, it's so exploratory. This is all just very exploratory.
Not a lot happens. People do a lot of talking, and people hang out in nightclubs.
Maybe the real game was the relationships we made along the way.
I mean, like, we've made a lot of jokes about this throughout this conversation, but like that is, I want to say, kind of the central message of the book in some ways. And like pairing it with a game that's all about those relationships, now that we're kind of talking about it in this term, feels like maybe the most genuine way to honor the game in some ways, or kind of the best way to use the game. Like, it's a game, it's a book about that. So the fact I didn't kind of realize that's the type of game system you should use for that type of game, you should feel embarrassed about, because like through that context I still go, but maybe a little more.
We're exploring, Charlie. We're exploring these ideas.
This is true.
We're allowed to be messy with it. That's the whole point.
Negative modifier, non actual play content messy? Never. I feel like we've talked ourselves out on this one. I think that's actually a pretty good high note to end out on. It's revelation about maybe the correct way to play this book as a game, hypothetically.
I don't think we can go on any more tangents.
No, I don't think we can. We're out of tangents at this point. And also now I'm going to go fucking see if there's a World of Darkness Deep One game, because I'm kind of curious.
Fucking here we go.
Yep. Yeah, so next book is
Mr. Magic by Kirsten White.
Yes, it is. It's on the shorter side. I think it's shorter than both books we've read so far. Maybe not Crota, but it's not as long as Wintertide, definitely. What would you summarize Mr. Magic as?
I have opinions. And I have very specific relationships to some of the concepts and like things that they've put out with this.
That's fair. We will get to that as part of that. I guess like it's where Crota was kind of your 90s horror. This was technically your Eldritch horror. This one's more surreal horror, I guess, is probably the label I'd slap on it in some ways, which some people may go, what the fuck does that mean, Charlie? You're just kind of mincing words at that point. As we said kind of earlier on, it's more King in Yellow than Call of Cthulhu.
It's like, how do I best describe it?
Shit's weird, yo.
I mean, other than shit's weird, yo, it's just like the uncomfortability of the unknowable.
Yeah.
But the uncomfortability of something that is overfamiliar. Like when a stranger is overfamiliar, that sort of just like vibe of just like, who the fuck are you? Why do you know this about why you're there? Like that is the general vibe I get from Mr. Magic.
Yeah.
And like when we talk about this shit, I'm just be like, let me sit down.
Next book, Mr. Magic. Hope you enjoy. Thank you for joining us. This has been another episode of Negative Modifier Reads, our book clubby thing. And we do hope you enjoyed Wintertide.